Hey, what's up? Andrew Kramer here for VideoCopilot.net, and welcome to a very exciting demonstration for our new plugin, Optical Flares. Now, the main idea with Optical Flares was to create a plugin that generates realistic lens flares and lighting effects that didn't look computer generated. So we thought about it, we studied it, and we worked on a plugin that could create stunning, anamorphic, natural-looking lens flares. And what's great is it's very powerful and very easy to use. Let's go and take a look at some examples of optical flares in action. Okay, so there's a lot of different uses for lens flares. Broadcast design, you have visual effects, you have a concert scene, music videos, motion graphics. Also helps to draw attention to your product or to an area of the screen. There's really a lot of cool uses for lens flares, and especially ones that look good. Now, because Optical Flares is such a powerful plugin with so many features, we've broken it down into different categories so that we can talk about each one individually. Well, I'll see you at the end, and hopefully you can appreciate all the awesome features built into Optical Flares. I'm Andrew Kramer, and we'll see you then. One of the most important parts of Optical Flares was creating a powerful, easy-to-use interface. So here I've applied Optical Flares to a solid, and we can move the light source around and control many of the settings as well as animate them. So here we have the heart of Optical Flares, the interface. Now, the first thing you'll notice is the large preview window where we can move around the flare, check it out, see what it does. We can also play around with the brightness and the scale, as well as show 4x3 guides. Now, this also pops out if we click on that, and it becomes a movable window that we can maybe put side by side with the interface. It also gives us a little bit more space in the object stack, but you can also look really closely at some of the detail of these elements. But another great feature is the show background feature. So if we click that, we can actually look at what the background looks like in our design. And the benefit of this is that we can refine our lens flare based on the way it blends with the background. Oftentimes you'll be looking at your lens flare on black and it may look good, but when you hit OK, it doesn't quite blend right. And hopefully this will save you time from opening and closing the option window. Now I can close the pop-out and it goes back into the core interface. Now the next thing we're going to take a look at is the object stack. And this is where all of the elements of your lens flare are stored. So we have a caustic, we have a glint, a glow, and there's just tons of elements that make up this one particular lens flare. We can click on them, and we can then come over here to the object editor and make adjustments to the settings. You can also hide certain elements while you're working, and by the way, if you hit OK, those elements remain hidden, so that if you're working on a lens flare and you're not sure if you want to get rid of that or not, you don't have to necessarily delete it, you can just hide it temporarily. You can also solo the elements so that you can work on them individually as well as delete them if you really want to. Now, another cool feature is the visual thumbnails that you'll notice on each of the objects. So here we have the glow and the caustic and the glint, and it's great because then you can kind of see what element is what. It really makes it easy to find specific elements. And it also updates live if you're to move the light position around. So you can see the caustic is down in the bottom left, and if I move my light source down here, the caustic now is in the top right. So a very handy, very cool feature that I knew we had to have from the very beginning. What's really great about Optical Flares is that it works a lot like After Effects with regards to the user interface controls. So I can click on a number and it opens up an input box where we can change the value with the keyboard. You can also click on a value and drag it left and right to change the setting. So just a quick way to go ahead and make any kind of refinement and adjustment to your settings. But wait, there's more. Just kidding. Well, there is, but I didn't mean to say that. You can also click on the name of an object and rename it. So this makes it great for organizing specific elements and finding the ones that you've just changed. Now, you also notice there's a wing arrow here, and this allows you to sort by type as well as by name. And when you do that, all of the elements go in alphabetical order so that you can look at all of the glow elements at once or look at all of the iris elements. So it's very organized. You can also rearrange the order of the objects. Just click on one, drag it, and it moves to that position. You can also use the mouse wheel to scroll through your objects, as well as the settings in the object editor. So this is the basic idea. You click on the objects here, the settings show up in the object editor, you can change them, modify them, and create this masterpiece lens flare. And of course, we have a great undo and redo system up to 25 states. As you're working, you can undo, redo any of the things that you've changed so that you don't accidentally make a mistake and, get stuck with something you don't want. One of the key workflow features is the ability to copy and paste settings from one object to the next. So to use the copy paste, just right click on a property, choose copy, go someplace else, right click, and choose paste. And we've set it up so you can't say copy a color and paste it into a number. It's just not available, and it even tells you why. Look at that. I didn't even know about that. And another thing is we have this dynamic triggering engine, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But there's a lot of settings here. And say instead of copying one of the settings at a time and pasting it, you can actually copy and paste groups. So I can take this entire group, copy it, go to another object, right click on the dynamic triggering, and paste all of the settings from there into that one. So it really makes it fast, easy, while you're working on these complex lens flares. Now, speaking of workflow, Optical Flares also features tons of keyboard shortcuts. Now, I'm not sure all of them offhand, but you can actually use the arrow keys up and down to go between the different objects. You can take an object, duplicate it with the same shortcut as in After Effects, which is Control-D, and that duplicates the object. You can also just come over here and hit duplicate to duplicate the object. Now, let's take a look at building a simple lens flare. So we'll come over here, click Clear All. Are you sure? Yes. So everything gets reset. We can go uncheck the Show Background. So we'll come over here and click on Lens Objects. And the object browser slides out, and here we have the 12 core objects that makes up all of our lens flares. So we'll start out with some of the basic elements. We'll add a glow, and we can move that around. And we'll come back over here to the lens objects. We'll add a multi-iris, maybe a spike ball, and maybe a streak. So here's a pretty simple lens flare, and we can go and just make a few adjustments to some of the settings, and there we go. Now we have this thing called global color. Now if we click on that, we can change all of the colors of all of the objects at once. And you also notice that we have a live color picker, which is something that we had to custom build. So, we were definitely trying to make this as powerful as possible. So I'll just hit OK. And now all of the elements have that same color. But what if I want one of my objects to be a different color? No problem. Just click on one of the objects, change the color source from global to custom, and now we can click on that and change it to whatever we want. We can hit OK. And by the way, here's a quick feature, is if it's on global, if you just click on the color swatch, it automatically switches it from global to custom. So you really don't have any extra steps other than just changing it to whatever you want. One of the other cool features of Optical Flares is the preset browser. So if we come over here and we click Show Presets, we have the preset browser. And by the way this works is that this slides out. We just click over here. You can also hit the space bar and that'll come out. And we can just click between objects or presets. And by the way, the objects, we have basic objects, but we also have custom objects. Now what the custom objects are the exact same as the basic objects, except the settings have been changed and then saved. So then we can just click on them and it gets added to our lens flare. But what if you make one that you really like this spike ball is just amazing. I've changed the settings and I love it. Well, we can just right click on it, choose Save as a Custom Object, and then that object will become available. Now, if you want to save the entire lens flare, just click Save Preset, and you can give it a name. Select a folder you want to save it to. In this case, we'll just save it to the custom presets, and I'll hit OK. And now it's available. So let's take a look at the preset browser. So we'll click Show Presets, and the preset browser slides out, and we have our folders. And you'll also notice there's a number next to each of the folders, and that just indicates how many presets are in that folder. So we can click on a folder, and now we can see a thumbnail for all of the great presets that are available. And if you've ever worked with a client who really wants to be involved, this is kind of a good way so they can start looking at different lens flares, and you just click on them and they load. And if we hit the space bar, it comes back up the same place that you were just at, and you can just go through and try out the different lens flares, and it's a lot of fun actually. And then we just click the folder back, or we can just use the navigation at the top. We can turn the show background back on while we experiment with some of the different presets. So we can click on them, and just kind of see what they look like in our actual design. And then when you find something that you like, we can just come over here, hit OK, and now that lens flare is back in our main comp where we can animate it and control all of the other settings. So be sure to check out the rest of the great features, and we'll see you soon. One of the most integrated features of optical flares is the ability to position a lens flare in 3D space or on a 3D light. So if we take a look at this example, you can see the lens flare is pretty large, and then when it goes off into 3D space, it gets a little bit smaller. So it automatically calculates the position, and you can really do some amazing things. So let's take a look at some of the different features of the 3D lens flare and see how they integrate into some real-world examples. First, let's take a look at how easy it is to set up a lens flare in 3D space. So here I have a basic scene in After Effects where I have my 3D layers, and I also have a 3D light in my scene. So pretty straightforward. Now I have a solid here, and I'm going to apply optical flares. So I'm going to choose Effect, Video Copilot, Optical Flares. So right away it starts out as a 2D lens flare, and that means I can move it around in X, Y space. But if I want to make it 3D, all I have to do is change the positioning mode from 2D to track lights. And this way, if I move the light around, the lens flare will follow it. So if we orbit around the scene, you can see the lens flare stays in 3D space. But what's cool is we can simply duplicate the light and move it, and now we have another light that exists in 3D space, and another lens flare is automatically generated. And the cool thing is we can go into the settings for the light, like maybe the light color, and if we change that, the lens flare actually takes on the colors of the light. So it's very cool and a very powerful way to work with 3D lights. Now here's another scene I've set up using the foreground occlusion. So if I orbit my camera around, you can actually see that I have lights in between the 3D layers, but they actually block the lights when they get in front of it. So it's a pretty cool feature, and just helps you as you're compositing and setting things up. Now I'll also point out, if you change your view from the active camera to say the top view, the lens flares actually render on the 3D lights. So this really helps to position things properly when you're using those orthographic views. Now if we take a look at this missile strike scene, I want to kind of show you some more of the advanced features. So I've simplified the scene a little bit with the particle system so that it renders a lot faster for this demonstration, but should work just the same. So I'm going to take one of my lights and I'm going to change the color of the light. So I'll hit AA and we'll change the color from blue to maybe green, and we'll hit OK. Now the particle system is also set up to link to the light color so that everything is kind of working together. So if we select our optical flares layer, you can see the positioning mode is set to track lights. Now I'll go ahead and lock this effects control window so that if I move my lights around, it'll stay up there while we play around. And you can see that it's set to use light intensity. So if we were to play around with the intensity of the light, the lens flare will actually get bigger and brighter. Here's another example where we're using optical flares to generate a concert scene and volumetric lighting. So if we just kind of scrub through this, you can see we have some 3D lights that are off in the distance, and it just looks like this really exciting scene. Now if we take a look at my After Effects scene, you can see I have a bunch of 3D lights positioned in 3D space. And if I take the Orbit camera tool and fly around, you can see that the lights are just randomly positioned in 3D space to kind of create a stage-like concert scene. Now what's cool is there's two types of lens flares. There's lens flares that look like spotlights, and then there's just large lens flares. And the way that's set up is by changing the name of the lights. We have A light and we have B lights. And so if we scroll down here, we have two copies of optical flares. We have optical flares A and optical flares B, and they're both on. But if I just shut off the B and only show the A flares, you can see that these are the ones that look a little bit like spotlights. Now let me go and hide the lights, Control-Shift-H. So optical flares is again set up to track lights, and it's also set to use a name that starts with A. So all of the lights that start with A will use this lens flare. Now if we look at the optical flares B, we can turn it on and shut the other one off. You can see that it's set to track lights and use the name that starts with B. So I could actually go in here into the options, make some adjustments to my lens flare, maybe add a big streak, hit OK. So now we have a streak on all of our lens flares, and those aren't being affected by all of the A flares. So that's how you can have multiple lens flare types in the same scene. And finally, what about using optical flares with your 3D rendered scene files? So, as many of you may know, you can actually export your scene data into After Effects. So in this case, I've rendered out my scene. So this is just an image sequence. And then using various exporters, Cinema 4D actually has a built-in way to export the scene files and lights right into After Effects. 3D Max also has a few solutions. So here we have the lights from my original 3D scene right inside of After Effects. So then I can turn optical flares on, set it to track lights. Okay, look, I intentionally made this blindingly bright, so I apologize. But instantly the lights track to the lights in your scene, and if you use something like dynamic triggering, you can get some cool effects around the edges. You can also see that the light goes behind the ball and obscures the light. So what I've also exported is a matte of that object, and then use that in optical flares so that it blocks it out as it goes past it. So really, we can play it a little more subtle and just have some light lens flares, but hey, if you're gonna do it, go all the way. No, just kidding. Don't, overuse them. If Spider-Man's uncle has taught us anything, is that with great power comes great responsibility. So remember that. Okay, well that's our quick look at the 3D lens flare feature of optical flares. Let's take a look at the automatic luminance tracking. So what I have here are some particles that are rendered with a particle system, and then I've pre-composed that particle system, and now optical flares is rendering a lens flare for each of those particle spots. And we're creating a lot of lens flares automatically from those light spots. And it's also tracking the brightness, the scale, and the color of the size of each of these particles. Let's take a look at setting this up. So we'll delete the optical flares, we'll turn our pink particles back on, and we'll create a new solid. So then we'll choose Effect, Video Copilot, Optical Flares, and I'm going to change the preset to one that should be available with the package. It's called Subtle Cool, and I just haven't organized them all yet. And we'll hit OK. And we're going to change the positioning mode from 2D, which is where we move it around in the screen, to luminance. And then we select the layer we want to track, which is our particles layer, and automatically we get particles. Now I want to change the brightness compensation, so if we turn that down, our particles won't be as bright, and there we go. There's a few settings here, depending on how essential the detail is. If you lower this, you won't have to render as much. And it's not half quality, but it's half sampling. So maybe some of the smaller particles won't register. But if you're only dealing with larger particles anyway, you won't have to worry about that. So kind of a fast feature. You can choose not to track the color and just use the color of your lens flare. And you can also control whether or not to track the scale or the brightness. So if you don't track the scale, the lens flares will all be exactly the same size. And likewise, with the brightness, they'll all be the same brightness. Otherwise, we turn it all on, and we can even turn our particles back on and change the transfer mode to screen, and everything is there, and it's having a good time. Let's talk about the dynamic triggering engine. Now, it's probably the most powerful feature of optical flares, but I will admit it's a little bit nerdy. However, if you give it a chance, I promise it's awesome. It's kind of like the girl at the library. She's got glasses on, her hair's up. She's cute, but she's a little nerdy. But if you just give her okay, maybe that's not the best example. Let's just take a look at what it's capable of doing, and I'll let you guys fill in the rest of that story. So here we have a lens flare, and it's one of the presets, and it has some dynamic triggering on it. So as I move the lens flare to the edge of the frame, you can see we get the splash of these elements coming on, and it's a pretty cool thing. It even has a little bit of triggering in the middle of the frame. As it gets to the middle, it kind of brightens up a little bit. Now, one of the things we've done is we've added an indication when an element has dynamic triggering, and that's this red stripe. So if we click on that layer and we scroll down, we can check out the dynamic triggering engine. So right now, the light source is being triggered from the center. So you can see the trigger mode is the light position, and the trigger type is the center. So if we preview the trigger, it's this big red area. And so as that light touches that area, it gets 55% brighter, and it also changes color slightly. So we can turn the brightness amount up, and maybe we can make the color, we can make it turn gold. I mean, this is extreme. So now if we move the light over the trigger area, you can see it gets brighter, and it also turns orange. This is the whole idea behind dynamic triggering. It's animation without keyframes. It's animation based on rules, based on a trigger type. You can control it from the border, from the center, from the light. And there's a few different examples I kind of want to go over with you. So let's take a look. So I'm going to load a preset that doesn't have dynamic triggering. So we'll click on this air missile preset. And it's just a standard lens flare. And what I want to do is add a little bit of a gleam as the lens flare goes to the outside of the frame. And then I want to come over to the lens objects and add a glow element. I'll click on that. Now it's pretty bright, but we're going to work on it. First, I want to change the stretch amount so that we squeeze it down to a very thin element. I can solo it and you can see what that looks like. And then what I want to do is set the auto rotate to the center of the frame. So click that. And then I can set the rotation to 90, and it'll almost point to the center. But I only want this to show up when my lens flare goes to the edge of the frame. So what we'll do is we'll scroll down to the dynamic triggering engine that's available on all of the objects. And what I'm going to do is first set the object's brightness to 0. And that's because I want it to be off until it is triggered. Now the trigger type is defaulted to the border and the object's position. So that's already set. So all I have to do is turn the brightness offset up. So we'll set it to maybe 200. And then if we move the element down to the edge of the frame, you can see it turns on. Now we can preview that trigger, and it's pretty large, so we might bring the inner and outer fall off range in so that it's a bit smaller. We can also change the fall off type so it's not perfectly straight and maybe exponential, which is a little bit smoother as it hits the edge of the frame. So we can shut off the preview trigger. And by the way, if you leave it on and you go to another object, it just shuts off and hides the preview. So Simple thing, but it'll come in handy for sure. Now again, I might want to change the color, so maybe as it triggers it also turns, red, and so that's nice and noticeable as it goes off and kind of out of the frame. Dynamic triggering is really about adding animation to your individual objects without having to keyframe it. You can control things like the brightness, the scale, the rotation, and for some of the objects, they have their own custom settings as well. Let's go and take a look at another example. So I'm going to turn my background back on for the scene that maybe I'm working on. This is a cool screenshot from the CryEngine, by the way. And I'm going to scroll down to the bottom, and I've prepared 2 elements already, and I'm going to turn those on. So the lens flare is doing its thing, and as it reaches the outside of the frame, the whole screen lights up, and then it kind of fades off. So these 2 elements, so if we solo those, the color elements that you're seeing only turn on when the light source touches the edge of the frame, and that can be for any part of the frame, and the light is always on the opposite side of the light source because that's where we set the distance. All right, let's take a look at one more quick example. We'll go to the lens objects, and we're going to add a multi-iris. So if we scale that up, that's what that element is. But I want to make a few changes. First, let's turn the spread of the multi-iris down. So that's really just in the center. And I want to change the object shape from a polygon to a circle. And we'll also scale it up some. Now, the thing about the dynamic triggering, again, is I only want this object to turn on when the light hits the center. So we'll scroll down to the dynamic triggering. We'll change the trigger type to from center and the trigger mode based on the light position. So when the light touches the center, that's when our trigger is going to be activated. So we'll turn the brightness of the object down to 0, since we don't want to see it yet, and we'll move the light source into the center. Then we'll turn the brightness for the trigger up, and maybe even the scale, just a little bit. And we can see what happens as the light touches it. It turns on, and as we go away from it, it turns off. Now we can change the fall off type to exponential or maybe even smooth. We can look at the trigger, maybe expand it and turn up the fall off range. And then we have this sort of effect. Now I'm going to scale up the object as a whole and maybe bring the brightness down a little bit. Basically what we have here is an object that only turns on when our light hits the center of the screen, and almost as if a flashlight were shined into the lens and it sort of created these rings of light. And that's the power of the dynamic triggering engine. Okay, let's take a look at the light flicker feature. So here we have a concert scene where we're using optical flares to create sort of a volumetric stage effect. And it's just a pretty cool shot. Now if we come over here to After Effects, I have a similar scene without any of the concert people. I guess they all left. So we'll click on the optical flares layer. Now one solution might be to alt-click on the brightness and add a wiggle expression, such as, 6, 15, maybe 25. And what this is going to do is change the brightness randomly over time. But the problem is it changes the brightness of all of the lights at the exact same amount. So what are the odds that these various lights are all doing exactly the same thing? Now if we look at this missile strike scene, there's 4 lights, but you might figure that the intensity would be random. So with optical flares, instead of using a wiggle expression on the brightness, we have a flicker control. So we can turn the speed up and we can turn the amount up, and you can see there's a randomize for multiple flares. And so what that's going to do is give you a random flicker value for each of the individual lights. So it may seem like a pretty simple feature, but if it wasn't there, you might have to go and add an expression into each of the individual lights, and if you want to change it, you'd have to go back, and it could be a mess. So the light flicker feature is pretty cool. Great for missiles because missiles kind of flicker. I recommend only using that feature for missiles. Optical flares has several features for making lens flares even more realistic. So one of the features is on-lens simulations, chromatic aberration, a matte box simulation, as well as some lens orbs. So let's take a look at how that can enhance the realism of your lens flares. So here we have a quick scene where we have this lens flare flying in. And I'm going to go to the lens flare layer, go up to the effects, choose options. So it's a pretty simple lens flare, only just a couple of elements. I'm going to turn on the show background feature. And just in the preview, I'm going to turn the brightness and the scale up so it's a little easier to see what we're doing. Now the first feature shows up in the global parameters because it is applied to everything in your lens flare, and it also gets saved with your preset. It's called the lens texture. Now optical flares comes with 12 high quality HD 1080p textures of on-lens grime, and these are pictures from real lenses. So let's click on DAG, and we'll shut off the show background, and right away you can see we start seeing this grime that's on the lens. And it's a pretty cool effect. You can control the illumination radius so that it only shows up really at that bright point, or you could turn it up really high so it always shows up. You have control over the brightness, and you can also load in your own texture, so then you can control the scale and the offset. And all you have to do is use one of the custom slots that are right below these built-in textures. And real quick, if anyone's using this as a tutorial, you can load custom layers just by going into the custom slot, selecting a layer or a texture as your image. So back in the interface, you can go ahead and play around with the different textures, but there's another feature I want to show you. It's called chromatic aberration. Now I'm going to add another object. So I'll choose lens objects. We're going to add an iris, and this is just going to make it easier to see the chromatic aberration. So we'll go back to the global parameters, turn on the purple fringe, and if we turn up the intensity and the spread, you can actually start to see the colors, and they begin to kind of bleed off away from the center of the frame, just like real chromatic aberration. And this is just a subtle effect that can really make your lens flare look a lot more realistic. There's two modes. There's purple fringe, and then there's red, blue shift. Now that's a little intense, so we'll bring that down. You just want it to be a subtle effect where you can just see the colors bleeding close to the edge, and it renders nice and quick, and just a cool feature to have. Now I'll go ahead and shut that off, and we'll take a look at another cool feature. So right here you can see we can load a texture image for the on-lens simulation, but we also have a procedural object called lens orbs. So we'll close the preview, we'll come over here to lens objects, I'm going to scroll down, and we have lens orbs. We'll click on that, and it's a little big and it's a little bright, but what these are is basically procedural spots that pop up wherever the light source is. So if we go down here, again, we have an illumination radius, so we can lower that so that it only lights up the ones close to the light source. Now, they may seem pretty bright, but if we look at it with our image, they're a lot more subtle. So that's another cool feature to have the show background, so you can see what your lens flare looks like when it's composited with your shot. So we'll shut it off, and let's take a look at some of the settings. So we can control the number of objects. So we can have a lot or just a few. What this is mimicking is having stuff on your lens that's out of focus and sort of blurring out. We can also duplicate the lens orbs. Now it makes an exact copy, so I'm going to change the random seed so that we have a whole new seed. We'll come up to the top, we'll scale them down so they're really, really small. And in fact, we'll shut off the lens texture for the moment. We'll come down here and we'll turn the brightness up. So now they just start looking like small specks. And if you're creative enough, you can go ahead and make them real small, turn up the number of objects, and if you want more, I'm not sure what the limit on this is, but you can just duplicate the object, change the random seed, maybe make these ones a little bigger and lower their opacity. So we really start to create this organic looking lens texture just from the procedural lens orbs elements. Then, if you want to really make it more realistic, instead of using a circle as the object shape. You can use a polygon, but you can also use a texture. And a texture are real images from real lens elements. So we click on the texture image, scroll down here, and we can pick one of the black and white ones or one of the color ones, hit OK. And we'll just turn the brightness up so you can see that a little better. But now we're using actual lens textures, so it really sells the effect. And if you want to randomize it a bit, just turn the number of elements down, duplicate the element, change the random seed so that it looks different, and then load another texture. So now we have two different textures loading in at the same time. So I've loaded a new preset, and I want to talk about the matte box controls. Now, in real life, a matte box goes around your lens and basically acts as a hood to block out lights from casting lens flares. So it's kind of an interesting concept that a lens flare plugin has a way to block them out. But here's how it works. If I move the lens flare outside of the frame area, it stays on forever until, it's so far away that it fades out. Now, if you want to make it more realistic where as the light source is outside of the frame, it should cut off, well, you just turn on the matte box, set it to box, that will be a good frame size, and if we move it outside the frame, then it sort of cuts out. Now, right now, it has a fade out, and the start range essentially is where it starts, and the fade amount is how far away it fades off. So if we set the start range to 0, that means it's going to start immediately at the edge of the frame and fade out about 20% outside. So we can extend that a bit and maybe make it fade out very little. So once it reaches a certain point, it completely cuts out rather quickly. And remember, you can go into any object, scroll down to the matte box control, and change the start range offset so that you can have certain elements cut off sooner than others. Optical Flares allows you to use real lens textures in your lens flare presets. So if we go into the options here, we have our standard lens flare, and I'm going to come over here to the lens objects and add an iris element. Now, this is a procedural mathematic object. Now, it looks pretty good, and we can give some smoothness and really play with the settings, but for some things you really want to make them look realistic. Why not use an actual iris element? So if we go to the object shape, we can change it from a polygon to a texture. And then if we click on the texture image, we see the texture browser. And we can scroll down and we can click through some of these real texture elements. And then if you find one you like, just hit OK. And we'll go ahead, we'll scale this up and we'll brighten it up and maybe even tint it a little bit of a color there. And we'll go back into the texture browser. And what's cool is it updates as you look through them. So you can find something that you like. And this also works with the multi-iris. So I'll go ahead and hit OK. Maybe we'll use that big one there. We'll hit OK. We'll add another lens object, the multi-iris. And just to show off a copy-paste feature, I can go to the object shape here, right-click, copy, click on the multi-iris, go down to the object shape, right-click, and paste. And it may be hard to see, but we've essentially pasted that exact same iris into the multi-iris. So now we have a pretty cool looking flare. Now we've also added some other unique functions as well. So if we go to the iris, I'm going to go into the texture image, and we're going to change it from being an iris element to one of these caustic elements. Now a caustic is sort of a light element that has some random characteristics about it. Now if we come up here, we can scale the object up and we'll turn the brightness up as well. Now the problem, it's a texture and it's not rotating, it's just sitting there. So if we take the object, we can go to the iris control and set it to orient towards the light. So now if we rotate it properly, and instead of rotating it, probably want to change the orientation. So we orient it towards the light source, and now that object points towards the light and looks a lot more realistic. Now we can change the distance from the light source by increasing this distance amount, maybe scale it down. But you can see that just really adds a more natural look to the flare because that is an actual real element from a real lens flare. Now, what's great about optical flares is we can use a custom layer for the custom texture. So in this case, we have this custom light array, and it's just some lights from a stadium, and we're going to use them inside of our lens flare preset. Now, I've already set it up, so I'll go in here, choose custom layer outside of the plugin. We'll set the source to the custom lights. And now you can see that they show up in our lens flare. And if I scrub through it, you can see that they're part of the lens flare, but they create that realistic blinding light effect where you have those elements show up kind of close to the screen. So let's just take a look at it and render it out. Okay, so hopefully you can kind of see the idea behind custom textures, and it's a pretty cool feature.